The New Testament. Who wrote the Gospels? After Jesus of Nazareth died and came back to life, around the year 30 after Christ, his teachings and what he did started to be passed on. At first, his followers in the young Christian community just told these stories out loud. For the first few decades, the main way people learned about Jesus' life was from what the apostles preached. The apostles told what they had seen and heard. And so, stories that were told out loud started to form. Stories of miracles, parables, sayings people remembered, and stories about his suffering and death. These stories were shared among the churches. The letters from the Apostle Paul, written in the 50s and 60s after Christ, show that there was already a main set of teachings about Jesus, even some basic beliefs and short stories. But a full life story hadn't been written down yet. It was probably starting in the 60s after Christ, when the first people who had actually seen Jesus started to pass away, because of bad times like when Nero was hurting people in 64 after Christ, and just because time was passing, that people felt they needed to write down Jesus' story in an organized and trustworthy way. Also, the church was spreading to new places, reaching groups of people far from the land of Israel like Antioch, Rome, and Alexandria. This made people want official stories to teach new believers. This is how the four main Gospels we know today came to be. But who really wrote them, and what was going on when they wrote them? This question has made researchers wonder for hundreds of years. Early church tradition said that each Gospel was written by an apostle or someone close to the apostles: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But when we look at history, it seems a bit more complicated. The Gospel writers often didn't put their names on their work, and they put together stories they got from other places. Most experts agree that Mark was the first Gospel written probably around the year 70 after Christ, shortly after the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. An old tradition passed down by Papias of Hierapolis around the year 125 after Christ says that Mark, who helped Peter understand things, wrote down accurately, though not in order, what the Lord said and did. This means John Mark, who was with Peter in Rome, likely wrote down what Peter preached. In fact, several early sources say that Peter himself told Mark what to write, with Mark acting as his writer. This traditional view says the author was John Mark, a Jewish man from Jerusalem mentioned in the book of Acts. He was Barnabas' cousin and traveled with Paul before joining Peter. So what do modern studies say? They agree that Mark's author was likely a second-generation Christian, maybe one of Peter's students. He wrote for a community, possibly in Rome or Syria, that was facing hard times and needed to strengthen their faith. Clues inside Mark's text, like explaining Jewish customs for non-Jewish readers or using many Latin words, point to an audience that wasn't Jewish. This supports the idea that it was written for people in a Roman setting. Mark writes in simple, lively Greek, focusing on action. His 16 chapters quickly tell the story from John the Baptist's work all the way to Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. He never names himself, none of the gospel writers do, but his way of telling the story feels urgent, like an apostle's account. Most scholars agree that Mark was written by a second-generation Christian, around or just after Jerusalem fell in the year 70. This way, he could write down what Peter and other witnesses remembered before those memories were lost. It's worth noting that Mark's original ending is debated. The oldest manuscripts end at chapter 16 verse 8, with the women running away from the empty tomb, scared. A longer ending, chapter 16 verses 9 to 20, shows up in later manuscripts. It sums up times when the risen Jesus appeared, which suggests someone else added it later to give the gospel a more complete ending. This detail shows how texts could be tweaked as they were passed down, even though most of the gospel stays just as Mark wrote it. So, for a long time, people have said that Matthew, one of the 12 apostles, Levi Matthew, the guy who used to be a tax collector, wrote the gospel that's named after him. A guy named Papias said that Matthew collected the logia, that means sayings of the Lord in Hebrew, and then everyone kind of translated them as best as they could. So, people think this means Matthew might have written down a bunch of Jesus' teachings in Aramaic or Hebrew, but the Gospel of Matthew that we have now is actually in Greek, and it looks like it really used Mark's Gospel a lot. When you look closely at Matthew's Gospel, it seems like the writer used Mark's Gospel as a starting point. Then he added a whole lot of his own material, especially big speeches with Jesus' teachings like the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5 through 7. So, most experts today believe Matthew was written after Mark, probably around 80 to 90 after Christ. They think it was written by a well-educated Jewish Christian who wanted to tell Jesus' life story in a really organized way, and to show how Jesus made Old Testament prophecies come true. It's possible this writer, and we don't actually know his real name, was part of the Jewish Christian group in Antioch, a city in Syria. That was a place where Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, those who weren't Jewish, lived together. Historical research suggests Matthew was probably written in Antioch, which was part of Roman Syria at the time. This gospel writer set up his story around 5 main speeches from Jesus. Maybe he did that on purpose, to kind of mirror the 5 books of Moses in the Torah, showing Jesus as like a new divine lawgiver. Even though Matthew is written in Greek, you can tell the writer knew the Hebrew scriptures super well. He often quotes prophecies saying things like, "This happened so that what was spoken by the prophet would come true." This makes sense if the writer was a Jewish person who really knew the scriptures and was writing for a church with many Jewish members. So, was this writer actually the Apostle Matthew? Well, most experts today kind of doubt it. The general view is that it's unlikely the Gospel of Matthew was written by an eyewitness, someone who was actually there. So, the Apostle Matthew probably wasn't the one who wrote the final version. But it's possible his teachings, or maybe a collection of his notes in Aramaic, were used as a base for it. Some scholars think that the Matthew that Papias mentioned might have put together a collection of Jesus' sayings. Experts call this the Q source. And then, the person who wrote our Gospel of Matthew used that Q source material, along with Mark's Gospel. Whatever the case, the person who wrote Matthew didn't actually sign their name to it. But they left some clues about themselves. They were bilingual, they knew the scriptures in Hebrew or Aramaic really well, and wrote excellent Greek. They cared a lot about Jewish law, like how they point out Jesus said he didn't come to get rid of the law but to complete it, in chapter 5 verse 17. And yet, they also showed a big picture view, since the gospel ends with sending the message out to all nations. Later on, important early church leaders, called the Church Fathers, said this writer was Matthew, based on what they'd heard from the time of the apostles. And that's how the title "According to Matthew" got stuck on it when copies started being shared around the end of the 2nd century. This is the first of a 2-part work. Luke and Acts of the Apostles, both written to a man named Theophilus, who was probably a sponsor or an important Christian official. Tradition says the author is Luke, the doctor, a companion of Paul, who is mentioned in the letter to the Colossians, chapter 4, verse 14, and other letters. What proof do we have? The writing style of Luke and Acts is polished, like that of an educated, Greek-influenced writer. Also, in the book of Acts, some parts are told using "we," which suggests the author was part of Paul's travels. Most people agree that the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles were both written by the same author, because they use similar words and are clearly connected as volume 1 and 2 of Christian history, the life of Jesus, and then the life of the early church. Luke starts his Gospel with an introduction, chapter 1 verses 1 to 4, in the style of Greek historians, saying he carefully investigated everything from the beginning and put the facts in order after gathering information from eyewitnesses. This shows that Luke was not a direct witness of Jesus, but a historian who collected traditions. In fact, just like Matthew, Luke used Mark's Gospel and added material from the Q source, as well as adding his own stories like the stories of Jesus' childhood in chapters 1 and 2, or unique parables like the Good Samaritan and the Prodigal Son. Many of these unique parts in Luke's Gospel focus on mercy for outcasts, prayer, the work of the Holy Spirit, and the dignity of women, reflecting the author's religious ideas. As for the date, Luke was probably written in the 80s after Christ, though this is debated. Some experts suggest dates between 60 and 90 after Christ. Those who suggest an early date, around 62 after Christ, base this on the fact that Acts ends suddenly with Paul in prison in Rome and doesn't mention his death, which happened around 64 after Christ, or the fall of Jerusalem in 70 after Christ, which suggests Luke might have finished the work before those events. However, most think Luke wrote after Mark, meaning after 70 after Christ, and that Acts doesn't mention Paul's death simply because the story's goal was to show Paul reaching Rome, or because Paul was still alive when Luke finished writing. In any case, it's believed Luke wrote his gospel for non-Jewish Christians outside of Palestine. Luke was written in a large city west of Palestine, maybe Rome or a big Greek city in the empire. About who really wrote it, some experts support the traditional idea that Luke the Gospel writer, a companion of Paul, wrote Luke and Acts, while others point out that Acts says different things than Paul's letters in some places, suggesting the author wasn't a close companion. For example, in his letters Paul calls himself an apostle, but in Acts, that title is only for the original 12, and there are differences in the details of his travels. However, these differences might be due to writing style or purpose, not because the author didn't know the facts. The idea of Luke as a doctor and a follower of Paul fits well with the educated and inclusive nature of this gospel, though we can't be 100% sure. In short, Luke was a first-century historian and writer about God who, inspired by spoken stories and written accounts, he himself mentions that many others had already tried to tell the story. Chapter 1, verse 1. He wrote an orderly story so you may know the truth for sure, he tells Theophilus. His work is known for being accurate with places and times. He names local Roman officials, dates, and so on, which suggests he researched first-hand sources. Maybe while Paul was in prison in Caesarea, he had time to interview witnesses in Judea. The result is the longest and most detailed gospel about Jesus, which is then followed by the story of the early church in the book of Acts. The fourth gospel is really different from the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in its style and what it talks about. It shows Jesus giving deep talks about God, like the beginning part that says, "In the beginning was the Word," chapter 1, verse 1, and miracles called signs that aren't in the other gospels, like when Lazarus was raised from the dead. The early church always said that this gospel was written by John the Apostle, son of Zebedee, one of the 12, and they said he was the beloved disciple who shows up in the story itself, in chapter 21, verses 20 to 24. But people who study it closely today have pointed out that John's gospel is different, and it was probably the last one written, around the year 90 to 100 after Christ, in the last 10 years of the first century. John was probably put together in Ephesus, which is in modern-day Turkey. That's what tradition says, though other places like Antioch or Alexandria have also been suggested. Anyway, it seems like John was written for a Christian community that had been around for a while, and they were having some problems with the official Jewish leaders. John often talks about Christians being kicked out of the synagogues, chapter 9, verse 22, maybe showing what things were like near the end of the first century. Who really wrote this gospel? Most experts today think it's not very likely that the Apostle John himself wrote the Gospel of John. This is because of a few things. John's Greek writing style is quite fancy and thoughtful, different from the simple style you'd expect from a fisherman from Galilee who didn't have a lot of schooling. Also, it looks like the Gospel was written in stages. For example, chapter 21 of John is clearly an added ending. Chapter 20 verses 30 to 31 finishes the book, and then chapter 21 picks up with another ending, maybe added by the author's followers after he died, to tell people who he was. The text itself hints that a group of people might have written it. This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down, and we know that his testimony is true. Chapter 21, verse 24. Here, a voice from the community is speaking. We know that it's true, backing up what the beloved disciple said. Many Bible scholars figure that the beloved disciple, who tradition says was John, son of Zebedee, was the main source for the memories in this gospel, but that maybe a final editor, one of his close followers, maybe also named John the Elder, as some old church writings mention, put together and edited those memories into the final version at the end of the first century or the beginning of the second. So, we could say that John the Gospel writer is both one person, the eyewitness loved by Jesus, and also a community, the group in Ephesus known as John's community, that thought deeply about who Christ was. The result is a very carefully crafted gospel, a deeply thought-out picture of Jesus' character and teachings, more than just a story told in order of time. This deep thinking about God, for example the long talks about the Father and the Son, the special prayer in chapter 17, makes it seem unlikely that an apostle wrote it directly, meaning that if the apostle was old when he wrote, he might have had his followers help write and organize it. In fact, church leaders from the 2nd century like Irenaeus said that John, the Lord's disciple, lived until the time of Emperor Trajan, around the year 100 after Christ, in Ephesus, and that's where he published his gospel, adding to what the synoptics said. This tradition, along with the idea that the beloved disciple was John, son of Zebedee, was mostly accepted in the church. More recently, some have suggested that the beloved disciple could be someone else, like John the Elder, or someone from a priest's family in Jerusalem, but not everyone agrees. So, when it comes down to it, who wrote John? We can say, a group of Christians close to the beloved disciple, who tradition says was the Apostle John, who, with his guidance or inspiration, created this unique written account. They themselves promise that the story is true, chapter 21 verse 24. Out of the four Gospels, this is the only one that clearly says an eyewitness wrote it. The one who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth. Chapter 19 verse 35, about the spear wound at the cross. So John claims to be based on what someone saw. The question is whether that someone was the actual writer or if other people wrote down what he saw. Either way, the fourth gospel shows first-hand memories, like knowing exact details about places in Jerusalem before 70 after Christ, for example, mixed with a deep spiritual understanding that grew over many years of thinking about faith. The first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, called the Synoptics, have a lot of parts that are the same, sometimes word for word in Greek. This shows that they directly used each other's writings. They're not separate books, but connected. Like we said before, the most accepted idea is the two-source theory. This means Mark was the first Gospel, and Matthew and Luke used it as a base for their stories. They also added another set of Jesus' teachings that scholars call the Q-source, from the German word Quell, which means source. The Q-source was likely a collection of Jesus' sayings, maybe like the one Papias said Matthew wrote. This helps explain why Matthew and Luke share many of Jesus' words that aren't in Mark, like Jesus being tempted in the desert, or a big part of the Sermon on the Mount, or the Sermon on the Plain. Also, Matthew and Luke each had their own unique material, sometimes called the M source and the L source. This connection shows us that the Gospel writers were a bit like inspired editors or collectors, more than just creative authors. They took stories they heard and things that were written down, and they put them together to share a message about God with their communities. For example, Luke says he looked at earlier stories when he wrote his. Matthew arranged Jesus' sayings into 5 main talks and grouped miracles by themes. So each gospel has layers of tradition. Behind the final text we can find phrases that might be older, from Jesus himself, translated from Aramaic to Greek, sayings that were shaped by the apostles' preaching, and finally, the gospel writer's own writing. But it's important to know that the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were linked to these gospels very early on. Around the year 180 after Christ, Bishop Irenaeus of Lyons clearly stated that there were 4 main gospels, each with its author. He said Matthew published his gospel among the Hebrews in their own language. Mark, Peter's follower, wrote his. Luke, Paul's companion, put the gospel that Paul preached into a book. John, the disciple Jesus loved, published his gospel while he was in Ephesus. What Irenaeus said so clearly shows that in the second half of the 2nd century, people already knew who traditionally wrote these gospels, and there weren't any other serious names suggested. Even more, Irenaeus insisted that it was right for there to be 4 gospels, no more and no less. He compared them to the 4 directions on a compass. He said this to argue against Gnostic groups who were writing other gospels. We know the Gospels were written down and saved not long after they were first made. The oldest piece of papyrus we know of from the New Testament is called the Rylands Papyrus P52. It has a part of the Gospel of John chapter 18, verses 31 to 33 and 37 to 38. Scientists who study old writing have dated it to around the year 125 after Christ, give or take about 25 years. This piece, which was found in Egypt, means that the Gospel of John, probably put together in Asia Minor around the year 90, made its way to Egypt within just a few decades. It's really small, only about 8.9 by 6 centimeters, which might fool you, but it's the oldest surviving record we have of any New Testament text. For the Synoptic Gospels, fragments from the 2nd century show they also spread early. For instance, Papyrus P104 is from Matthew, and other early fragments like Papyrus P90 from John also point to how quickly New Testament writings were shared. By around the year 200 after Christ, we have even larger collections on papyrus. Papyrus P75, which has large parts of Luke and John, and Papyrus P45, with pieces from all four Gospels in the Book of Acts, both date to the 3rd century. These manuscripts show that the text of the Gospels, even with some small changes you'd expect from people copying them by hand, stayed pretty much the same. Starting in the 4th century, we have almost complete copies of the four Gospels in famous codexes, which are like ancient books, such as Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus. Both of these are from between the years 325 and 350, and they show a text that's very close to what we read today. In fact, Codex Sinaiticus is the oldest complete copy of the Christian Bible. It includes the Old and New Testaments in Greek, and it already has the four Gospels with those exact titles. Interestingly enough, in Codex Sinaiticus, the Gospel of Mark ends at chapter 16 verse 8. This confirms that the longer ending wasn't in the oldest manuscripts. This supports what we mentioned earlier, that important additions to the text can be found by comparing the different copies. Besides cases like these, like the ending of Mark or the story of the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 7 verse 53 to chapter 8 verse 11, which also isn't in the oldest codexes, the differences between manuscripts from different centuries are very small. They're usually just spelling changes, different words that mean the same thing, or notes written in the margins. It's amazing that, for a text that was copied by so many people by hand, we can be very sure about what the original text said. With more than 5,800 known Greek manuscripts of the New Testament of all different sizes, we have more proof for the Gospels than for any other ancient writing. Having so many copies has allowed scholars who study texts to carefully figure out what the original writing most likely said. Even though the early manuscripts give us important proof about how the words in the Gospels stayed pretty much the same, they had a really big and wide-reaching effect on early Christianity. The Gospels weren't just history papers, they were what the early Christians built their beliefs and actions on. From the 1st century on, these writings were read and really respected in Christian groups all over the Roman Empire. They were the main place people learned about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The Gospels laid out the main ideas for what early Christians believed, and this changed how believers thought about big ideas like being saved, grace, and the kingdom of God. Also, the Gospels played a super important part in how the early church worshipped. When they gathered for worship, they would read parts from the Gospels, helping the believers know how to live right and grow spiritually. They were also used for teaching, which means teaching new believers about the faith, and this helped spread the Christian faith. The Gospels didn't just affect spiritual things, they inspired art, books, and early Christian music. Pictures showing scenes from Christ's life, which were told in the Gospels, decorated the walls of underground burial places called catacombs and churches. Hymns and prayers often used words taken right from the Gospels, making those words a part of the believers' everyday lives. As Christianity grew and spread, the Gospels were translated into many different languages like Latin, Syriac, and Coptic, which made it possible for their message to reach different cultures and groups of people. Sharing the Gospel writings helped bring the early church together, giving them something they all shared for worship and belief, even though they lived in different places and had different ways of life. So, to sum it up, the Gospels were super important in shaping what early Christianity was all about and what it was trying to do. They gave everyone a shared story that brought believers together, showed them what to believe and how to live, and inspired so many ways for people to show their love for God and be creative. What the Gospels left behind is still alive today, as people continue to honor them and study them. Thanks for watching our video about the Gospels. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends. See you in the next video.